Hello everybody, this is Krista and welcome back to Adventures and Metaphysics and another Tarot and ADHD, Tarot meets ADHD video. And so today I wanted to talk all about ADHD and specifically tarot collecting. This has been something that's kind of been on my brain for a little bit and something I've been exploring and kind of trying to think through and research recently. So I still feel like there was more research I could do, but I just really wanted to talk about it. So I kind of work through my thoughts that way. So I have a few things written down to share, but otherwise this might get a bit rambly because it's just kind of me making sense of it all along with you. So, where do I want to start? I think, so when I was trying to look up ADHD and collecting, because I have seen somewhere that ADHD, but along with a lot of other neurodivergencies, there is kind of collecting habits that come with it. Like having collections of things, and collecting is something that I have done and found a lot of joy in since I was very, very, very little. I got in trouble many times for the rocks that would go through the washing machine that I would pick up from the playground. I always had a collection of something, whether it was dolls or pins, and it always brought me a lot of joy. So when I was trying to research that, I found it very interesting because nothing specifically about that really came up. Every headline, on Google or Google Scholar that I was seeing said ADHD linked with hoarding disorder. And so that threw me for a bit of a loop. I'm not gonna lie. I think that's kind of why this has taken me so long to get my thoughts together, because I was just going through pages and pages of seeing ADHD and hoarding disorder. And I'm not going to sit here and say that, there's not a link there, because clearly, there is, and not to say that people don't struggle with that. I can only talk from my own personal experience. So again, all of these things are framed in my experience, my journey with all of this. And it was just really discouraging to see it kind of framed in this really, really negative way. And posing it, obviously, when there is a hoarding disorder going on, that is something negative and something that's negatively impacting someone's life. And so trying to kind of just research collecting habits and just having that come up was discouraging. So we tried it from different angles, because I spent some time working through it, because the first panic, of course, is, well, gosh, am I hoarding? Like, could I possibly be hoarding? But no, that's not something I do. I love collecting tarot. Maybe I should have started there. Sort of my not stance, but habit, or I don't know, whatever the right word is. I am a tarot collector, and it has taken me a very long time to feel comfortable saying that. And we'll get into it, but certainly not a tarot hoarder, because I have a very free-flowing collection. Words are not coming out right. Collection. And so when a deck isn't working, I have a very easy time moving it on to someone else who I think will like it, and then bringing something in that I want to try. So that's not really what's going on there. And of course, again, I'm not at all trying to discount any sort of experience around hoarding behaviors linked with ADHD. Again, it's just not my experience, so I can't speak on it. Anywho, how do I want to talk about this first? Oh, okay, so as I was sort of thinking about tarot collecting and how that sort of started for me, is a few years back, I started learning how to read tarot a few years ago now, and I started out with my cat tarot, as you know, and I actually also had the Jane Austen tarot, the one you can find like in Barnes & Noble too now, not the, I think it was Lo Scarabeo that put one out. Oh my gosh. If I could ever have my hands on that deck, I would die. Jane Austen is my favorite. And there is the mass market one out now that is the 50, it turns it into like the 52 card deck, I think, which I have since, or I quickly rehomed that when I started like getting in more tarot decks, because that one didn't make too much sense for me to keep learning off of. Now I'm kind of like, I kind of miss that one. I had to say I kind of miss that one. Anywho, besides the point. So I spent a while with my cat tarot and my Jane Austen tarot. And I was learning through podcasts and audiobooks and things of that sort, and also just pulling with my friend Rachel, who introduced the whole thing to me. It wasn't actually until this past October, maybe, that I was introduced to TarotTube. But I did get into deck collecting before that. It probably started once we were kind of able, you know, in the pandemic, but once it was kind of deemed safer to go into stores again, I would go into Barnes & Noble, like my local metaphysical stores, and I just wanted to try out new decks, and I was just so interested in how every different deck had such a different take on this one system. I found it, and still do find it, so fascinating. So once I kind of realized that was the case and saw it through that lens, that, you know, there was more out there than my cat tarot and the Jane Austen deck that I was learning off of. I'm very glad that, you know, that's kind of how I learned. I really spent a long time like just consuming whatever I could, whatever information I could, and using that deck to learn how to read. So actually, I guess you could say it became a hobby then, because that's what I would spend just like so much of my free time listening to information on it. But I suppose deck collecting became a hobby basically once I was able to go into Barnes & Noble again. And so, I know where I was going with that. The link with that is that a common trait of people with ADHD is hobby collecting, actually, or just intense hobbies. And I say that in like not a negative way by any means, but hobbies are a great way to get those dopamine hits that our brains so badly need. You know, I'm not even gonna say, I think a lot of the times the language is that we seek out, but I think it's important to note that the level of dopamine we have in our brain is not what we need, and that's why we seek it out. So I like to say giving the dopamine that we need, and I think that just frames it more, just in a more positive and to me truthful to myself way. Anyhow, so, which is really funny because I feel like, so I know that a lot of people will experience kind of jumping from hobby to hobby, and I've for sure done that, where you kind of get all the supplies and you're so excited about it and you do it for like a week and you're done. I did that with like a wood burning pen, which I still have. I keep the few little bits and bobs around because I do circle back. I love art supplies and crafting, and I will like circle back and like use them. It just doesn't become the intense hobby that at the time I hoped it would. And so, yes, so I think a lot of people experience really collecting hobbies, and which I think is like an interesting phrase to use. And jumping around from different ones quickly. But I would say what comes even more to mind of, again, my experience, and I do think, or I was reading a lot that I think a lot of other people with ADHD feel the same, is that you will find that hobby that you can just so intensely immerse yourself in. And that's because there's something about the hobby, about the community it puts you in, that will continuously, forever, just supply those little bits of dopamine, which I think is really cool. The other thing I kind of want to say is that there were a lot of articles on hobbies and hobby collecting, and they're framed in a negative way. But I think it's such a fantastic ability that we have to become so immersed in something that brings us so much joy and that we love so much, in a way where you just like learn everything and anything. So I feel like a lot of this video is going to be talking about kind of how when I was researching, a lot of it was framed in a way that posed it as a problem. And I'm not here to say that it can never be a problem, because it does come with sort of the impulsivity aspect that, yeah, can be harmful if you aren't aware. But I don't think it really takes into account all of the many positives that like being so intensely into a hobby can have. Anyhow, so I've had a few of those, in my bit of lifetime so far. I was all through high school and college, I was so into makeup and what would you call it? Makeup tube? Makeup YouTube. I would watch like no one's business, and I knew how to do all of these amazing things with makeup, and it brought me so much joy to put it on every day. And the only reason that ever stopped is, I want to say pre-pandemic. I just kind of ran out of the time to do it on some days. But also just things of like discovering that, putting on so much like foundation all the time just wasn't, my skin didn't react well to it. So that's kind of why I would stop, or why I did stop putting, just doing my makeup a lot. It's something that I do still watch. I do still watch makeup YouTube videos, because it's such an art, and it's so fascinating. And when I do put on makeup, I still get a lot of joy out of it. But I'm just not as intensely immersed in that hobby as I was, which is okay. And so what followed that was tarot for me. And it's been, again, a few years now, and it's just done so much good. It's done so much good for me. And so I kind of wanted to speak on that a little bit in terms of the hobby and hobby collecting and hobby hyperfocus, because that's what it comes down to, is the ability to hyperfocus on things. And again, there's a negative connotation to that word that I don't think necessarily needs to be there, because once I discovered tarot and realized how much good it did for me in a self-growth way, and how much more there was to discover, and also combining my interest in art and just the kind community that now through YouTube I have really discovered, and Instagram, it's it's consumed my life, but in the best way possible. So I kind of wanted to touch on that, of just that being able to hyper-focus on something so intensely isn't always bad. And if it's bringing you joy, I think that's a big thing to take into account. Because the positives of being so hyper-focused is that you might go out and learn just like everything and anything you can about that hobby, become really immersed in the community and a creative participant in the community. And so I think that's really something cool that can happen. And so, that being said, tarot collecting, circling back around, as a hobby, in my brain, the phrase that I kind of tied to it is that it is just the ultimate dopamine hobby, because it's become a really big thing these days. You know, there's no denying that. A lot of people are finding an interest in tarot and oracle, which is so cool. And so that means that a lot of decks are coming out, and a lot of new perspectives are coming out, and new people talking about it. And so there's always something new to seek and something new to get, and those are all going to give you those dopamine hits you need. And it doesn't seem like it's slowing down anytime soon. And so I think that's why, at least for me personally, it's been such a long-standing interest and hobby, is that it's endless what I can learn, what I can see and do with these cards, you know, and the people I can meet and talk to. So I say that in the most positive way, of it being just the ultimate dopamine hit hobby. If I'm looking down, I have my notes here. I'm trying as hard as I can to not ramble, but it's what I do. Okay, where do I want to go next with this? I think where it makes sense to go is, we're going to circle back around to kind of when I said that calling myself a tarot collector is something that, honestly, not even, like, it's been the last few days I've been able to somewhat comfortably call myself that. And even so, it feels weird to say, and feels, I'm not gonna lie, shameful to say. It feels like there should be shame for me associated with it. And I think it's because I look through it, or I'm just looking at the world now through this lens of knowing that I have ADHD. And so, you know, the symptom with that is impulsivity. So I attach that to myself a lot, even I think when it just really doesn't apply all the time. And I see myself a lot as buying decks as this terrible bad impulse, when it's not. And sometimes it is, you know, sometimes we all have that impulse buy, and that's okay. I think the thing to say is that any sort of hobby or collecting in any sort only becomes a bad thing if it is affecting your life in a negative way. And that's going to be different for everyone. What that looks like is different for everyone. And I think if you are someone who is kind of struggling with that idea and sort of making a connection, I guess, with what I'm saying here, I think just taking the time to know what those boundaries are for you, I suppose. So I would imagine a common one is, you don't want to be overspending on your budget because you wanted to get an extra tarot deck that month or something, or bringing in so many at once that you get overwhelmed, because that's a thing too, is that just a neurodivergent trait is becoming easily overwhelmed. And so that's different for everyone, and I think that's something, you know, of course, to take into account too. But all that being said is that those boundaries are different for everyone, and I think it's important to kind of sit down with yourself and think about what those are. But if you are staying within the parameters of those boundaries you have with yourself, and deck collecting is still bringing you joy and is something that you have a lot of fun with, then you shouldn't allow yourself opportunity to shame yourself, is what I'm trying to say there. Because I think that's something I've been really experiencing. I've been putting onto myself these negative views of ADHD traits onto myself when I don't necessarily portray them all of the time. And that I'm able to recognize if it is happening, you know, and either put a stop to it or decide not to. So, you know, I know what the boundaries are for me, and yet I still like to put a lot of shame and embarrassment around just liking to collect and to have. I think that's the thing, is that I feel an embarrassment a lot around just wanting to have. But when it comes down to it, I love seeing new decks and new art and new perspectives, like I've said. And also when it comes to my reading practice, I love having variety, and having the variety really works for me. Which is not to say that, you know, necessarily the number I have is what I need to have variety. No, I'm not saying that. You know, you could have 2 and that's technically variety, and if that works for you, then awesome. I think this all to be said that ADHD or not, tarot collecting sometimes I think gets a lot of shame put around it, where I wish it wouldn't. Because some different things work for everyone. And so if you see yourself solely as a tarot reader and not a tarot collector, so you've got those, you know, maybe 2 or 3 decks or 4, 5, you know, whatever, like, or even just 1, you know, if you see yourself as just a tarot reader, I guess, you know, technically if you have 2, 3, that's a collection of sorts. Numbers aren't important here. So if you see yourself purely as a tarot reader, or purely wanting to be a tarot reader, and you've got that deck that is like so beat in and has so much of your energy in it, and like that's how you see it and that's what you like, then I think that's awesome. But like I've heard mentioned a few times on YouTube, there's a distinction. And I think making that distinction in my brain really helped between tarot reading and tarot collecting. And I think a lot of the times that's where the shame comes from. Because I think there is this idea out there that in order to be an effective tarot reader, or to even like attach spirituality to a tarot practice, which is something that is really important to me and something I have done, that there's this idea that you can't have, and that you need to spend time, and a lot of it, with certain decks. And I don't think that necessarily has to be true. And I think that's just something I am working through, and sort of how I think I have attached shame around my collecting. But when it comes down to it, if I just take all of those ideas out that I know I don't find to be true, I find so much endless joy. And I know my limits and I know my boundaries, and everyone has to. Because it's the only way any kind of collecting, you know, is gonna work. And I think as long as you find your place where you are getting the most joy out of it, the most dopamine hits in a way that makes sense for you, then I think that's really awesome. And so I feel like that went a little bit rambly, and I meant for that all to be tied to ADHD, but I think all in all, on that, and then I'm just gonna go into some personal tips that I have. It's okay to keep doing something that brings you a lot of joy and doesn't, again, affect your life negatively otherwise. So you gotta set those boundaries and figure that out for yourself, because it's different for everyone. But any sort of tarot collecting, however you want to do it or not do it, is not, in any sense of the term, a problem, unless, again, it personally becomes one for you. But that's you as an individual. Like, the rules are going to be separate for you. So yeah, I think that's something I am still actively working on. It's not something that's gone away, that sense of shame, but it's getting better. And I feel like being able to use the term tarot collector, because I consider myself a tarot collector and a tarot reader, and to an extent they are mutually exclusive. And I think that is what works for me, and I think in general they are mutually exclusive. Because of my ADHD, do I find it best to bring in a variety of decks to my spiritual practice? Yes. So, in a sense, collecting is intertwined in that way. But other than that, two separate things, Okay, I feel like that's enough rambling about that. So, some tips I have of things that have helped me, because it is, the ways that, I suppose, the things that come with some people's ADHD that can hinder rather than help, are things that you want to, find ways around to just kind of help yourself. So that's what my tips are involving, of things that I've noticed that either I do or can't do, I suppose, that put me in an uncomfortable position for myself. So the first one of that is that I can't keep anything organized. Something is always gonna be messy, and the real backwards thing is that my ADHD makes it really hard for me to organize and keep organized and keep clean. Yet, when I'm somewhere that is cluttered or feeling cluttered and disorganized, it makes everything feel worse. So I don't know who decided to put those two things together for one brain, but it was not nice. So I'm sure, as if you've kept up with my tarot cabinet organizing saga, I feel like it's been I change out how I store my decks. I feel like every few weeks, and that's okay, but finding some kind of way to organize them that makes sense to you, I think is really important. And another thing I'll say is finding a way to organize them that allows you to see all, if not a majority, of your decks, because there is that object impermanence. So I experience it in a way where it's not necessarily that I completely forget I have a deck, where like I would go out to the store and accidentally buy it again. That's not the case. But I will kind of forget it exists and will forget to ever use it if I'm not directly seeing it. So my latest organization and my favorite so far, and I think is really gonna stick, is I got these bins from Amazon. I don't really know what they're meant for. Files, maybe? I don't know. But they're just these. So I got 3 of them. 2 of them fit in the cabinet, and 1 stays outside. And so this one that has stayed out is my are my seasonal decks. So right now I just switched these over to my more like late spring going into summer, which works for me because I tend to work with my decks seasonally. Oh my gosh, you probably just saw all that mess. As you can see, disorganized, but I tend to work with my decks seasonally. Not exclusively, I will pull out my Halloween tarot deck in the middle of June, but it's helpful for me to kind of switch things out that way to kind of have a rotation. But anyway, what's really nice about these is that I can stand them up straight, and if I pull it out, I can see, bird's eye view, everything I have. And so I broke it up where these are seasonal, and inside the cabinet I have my nature animal, because that's what I love, that's what I tend to have the biggest variety of, and then everything else in the other bin. So I know where to find things based on what I'm looking for, and if not, I can pull out the bin and kind of scan and be like, oh my gosh, I haven't worked with that one in a while, let's take that one out, which has been really cool. So going back to a deck rotation, I think also if you are someone who collects and has a larger number of decks, what has helped me is having some sort of deck rotation schedule or method, of which I've just realized I kind of have a few. So the first one, like I just mentioned, I will have out, where I can see them next to my reading table, the decks that I kind of associate with the seasonal feel at the time. So that is a good way, because I don't think my brain can attach a season to every single deck I have. Again, it's not necessarily exclusive, and some decks can fit into multiple, but I can do it. So that means that at some point during the year, every deck gets put in this bin where I see it, and then, I notice if I haven't picked one up. And then maybe that's one I want to consider rehoming because I haven't worked with it, and I probably am not interested in working with it, and that's okay. And then also the new thing I've been doing of my weekly deck rotation, which has been really a lot of fun and really helpful for me to kind of work through whether they're new decks or older decks, ones I'm unsure about. It gives me this solid method and a good span of time for me to work with a deck. And that's been a lot of fun to, pull out my old favorites, or ones that are new but I know I'm really gonna like, or ones I'm kind of questioning, is this gonna work for me, or do I need to rehome it? Well, I have a solid way to make sure I really give it the time of day. So that's been really helpful for me. Also, so the next two tips revolve around Lisa and Peggy Papez, because I just think they have come up with the most genius ways of collection management, I guess you could say. Yeah, that's what I'm gonna call it. So Lisa's This or That video series is my favorite. Oh my gosh, I love watching that. So what she does, if you're not familiar, is this is sort of a declutter process for her. She will pull out 2, sometimes 3 decks that for her feels like they fill the same role, feel the same, or whatever it is. In some way they feel similar to her in some way. And her goal is to compare them and ultimately rehome one of them, to have one remaining and rehome the other. Sometimes she's rehomed both or kept both, just depends. But I think doing that process has been really helpful for me. I'll do it with, when personally the number of decks I have starts to feel a little bit overwhelming, I will go through and do that. And it's not in an effort to necessarily do this huge deck haul or get rid of decks just because I'm feeling uncomfortable, because again, I do get easily overwhelmed, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I am going to want to get rid of something just because I'm sitting in that feeling. You know, I think it goes both ways, because it's easy for me to look at, like, okay, when I'm feeling good and I have, you know, like, it's not overwhelming, then I don't have to do like a deck declutter. But I also don't want to do it on the opposite end when I am feeling overwhelmed. You know, I kind of want to be in, honestly, kind of want to be in, I want to be in that, like, feeling good or just feeling neutral kind of place. Because I never want to get rid of something just because I'm feeling overwhelmed, because it's hard to pinpoint where the overwhelm's coming from. And a lot of times for me, it's when I've, you know, watched something or heard something that kind of brings on those feelings of shame. But that's the experience I have. Where was I going with that? Oh, so I really like doing the this or that with decks I currently have. If I'm feeling like there's one that's not really working out, I really do like going, okay, do I have something that I've been grabbing instead? And a lot of times it's a yes. But I also will do it if I am considering purchasing a new deck. I really make an effort to, like, this or that, even though I don't have it in my hands. And so I do that to an extent, but not always very intensely, because I personally don't like to limit myself in the ways of, like, okay, like, I want to buy this fairy themed tarot deck. Well, I already have a fairy themed tarot deck, so maybe that means I shouldn't get it. Where in reality, they can be completely different, have different ideas about fairies. And it's a good example because that's what's really interesting me right now. And so I want to see all those perspectives and try out new decks to kind of find the one that's really gonna connect with me, because that's something that I am, you know, exploring in a spiritual way. So, like, I'm just interested to try out the ones that are interesting to me. So, you know, this or that, I do it to an extent. But Peggy also created a little worksheet you can do, which is on her blog, which I'm hoping I will remember to put the link. I've realized I've said that in the last 3 videos. Don't think I've put a link to anything. I'm gonna get better at that. Maybe. I'm gonna try. So she has a worksheet that goes with Lisa's series, Say Yes to the Deck. And it's this whole thing that you can fill out when you are considering buying a deck, or you're trying to choose between a couple decks, but, you know, you just are gonna get one. And it helps you kind of sort through the reasons why you want them and all that. And so I think those 2 things have been helpful to me in terms of avoiding the impulsivity that can happen, you know, that may be a bit negative. And it helps me to be more mindful. And so it's not me going and saying, okay, I'm going to do this because I am feeling embarrassed or feeling shame that I want to get another deck and I'm trying to convince myself not to. It's just doing it to, you know, make sure I am making the decision from a place of, like, okay, I've thought about this, I know exactly why I want it, I know I'm excited about it, and it's not just, like, in that moment, so that's why we're gonna do it. And, you know, sometimes the result is like, oh no, okay, like, that excited me because, you know, it excited this other person, or it excited me, but now that I've looked a little further into it, there's some things that I don't think are gonna work for me. You know, that happens, and, you know, that's good too. But yeah, I think that was the last tip I had. I think this is something, you know, I'm not making this video to say I have nailed down all of my thoughts on this, because I've not. And again, it's still something I'm working through and trying to make sense of. But I think that is all I have to say for today. This might be one I revisit. But all in all, tarot collecting is something I really enjoy. And I'm figuring out the ways that maybe, you know, my ADHD tendencies could add to that in a way that doesn't make me feel good. But sorting through that, the connection I'm trying not to make is that, like, tarot collecting is bad because there could be bad tendencies that I have. Where it's like, no, you know, I've worked through those. I've figured out tips for myself to, you know, avoid those things, and I still love it, you know? And so I'm gonna continue letting myself enjoy it, because, I don't know, that sometimes I make the disconnect between my spiritual practice with it and the collecting aspect and the joy I get out of it in that way. Because when I'm over here in the collecting aspect, it's all for fun, and all because it brings me a lot of joy, and I love talking about it, I love learning about it, and, you know, that's not something I want to deny myself. So, anyway, I hope this was maybe helpful in some way, and maybe starts a conversation of sorts. But I think those are all of my thoughts. I said that already, and I'm gonna actually stick to it this time. But yes, I think I will revisit this maybe in a bit if I learn any more. And we'll see what the next topic might be. I'm kind of thinking of doing one on deck deep diving. I'm still kind of working through that myself, in terms of methods that work for me to do more of a deep dive, because that's something I have not been able to do with the methods out there that I've seen. Like, some things I can do, but then it's like, okay, reading through a whole guidebook, I've tried. It doesn't happen for me, and that's okay. Anyway, that'll be for next time. So I hope you enjoyed this video and didn't mind me rambling so much, but other than that, I hope you have a wonderful beginning to your week.